G'day, mate. Luke Forward here, keeping an eye on the news. Matt Gaetz is making his move to become the Speaker of the House. The Republicans only have a narrow majority in the House of Representatives. So far, it doesn't look like Republicans are doing a great job of governing. It seems like they're much more interested in making a spectacle of themselves than doing the hard work of governing. They don't exactly seem like the adults in the room, but who knows? Maybe Matt Gaetz has hidden talents, hidden powers. On the other hand, maybe he's reaching for a level of visibility that's just not good for him, all right? I love the motto, bringing souls out of hiding. There's one 12-step program that I go to that has that motto, bringing souls out of hiding. That's often the motto behind under-owning 12-step programs. But not everyone is equally, cut out for leadership, all right? Not everyone's equally cut out for all levels of visibility. And so will Matt Gaetz rise to the occasion, or will he fall apart? Keep an eye on that. And I've been listening to a lot of If Books Could Kill. Really enjoy this podcast. A couple of lefties here. And they do a Patreon special on Barry Weiss's terrible Substack.
Fans know I was recently fired for speaking my truth because my employers found out about my other podcast. And I recall when HR sat me down and they said, Peter, you're the best looking guy here, and you're the smartest person we've ever met, but we still have to let you go due to cancel culture.
The funny thing is, Peter, you're actually like a better free speech martyr than this lady is.
I knew that this would happen. I got fired. Like Vulture wrote a thing about me getting fired in like their podcasting section.
Thanks, Nick.
No one reached out to me to be like, hey, heard you were canceled. We're going to give you half a page in the Times or whatever. Right. These fucking people build entire careers off of this, off of being a brand executive, right? Like the management of the Levi's brand is her job. Yeah. And she's appearing on Fox News shows to take controversial positions about COVID restrictions. Right. And the company steps in and says like, well, obviously we don't want people who are associated with Levi's, like taking controversial positions on extremely high-profile television shows. That's a brand issue. Yes. You're the head of brand.
Part of your job.
These stories are like the heart of the cancel culture panic in this country. And what makes them effective is that there is a truth to them, right? Companies do not want their senior executives going around on Fox News and saying controversial shit. That is true. Yeah. But a couple things. One, this is not a phenomenon of the left. And that is the implication both here and throughout Barry Weiss's work, right? That this is something that she's being punished for only because she questioned certain liberal orthodoxies. There are plenty of left of center positions that will get you into hot water in the same way, right? If you criticize the military, the police, Israel, all of these are similarly controversial. If you have podcasts about the Supreme Court,
for example,
in my experience, that'll get you fired almost 100% of the time. The idea that you can just say whatever from the left and be fine is ludicrous.
Well, there's also a lot of companies where like saying Black Lives Matter would get you fired. Mm-hmm. They're trying to exoticize what is effectively like a form of marketing. Like companies use political issues as marketing now. This is nothing new. I don't love it, but it's just a phenomenon. Yep. I also think that it's like really dystopian and fucked up that like rank and file workers, like if you're an Amazon warehouse worker, you could potentially get fired for tweeting something. Yep. But that's because it harms people who don't have as many other options, and it could actually have stakes involved.
Right. And not to continuously circle back to my expertise in the Supreme Court, but there's a case, Burwell v. Hobby Lobby, where the court held that privately held companies can refuse to provide contraceptive coverage to their employees on religious grounds, even when required by law. Right. Companies have long had the ability to dictate material aspects of their employees' lives, and conservatives have always bolstered their ability to do it. Right. If they wanted to help build a world where the balance of power between workers and companies is shifted, they could, but they don't want to.
Right.
All they want to do is create a social climate that favors them, that allows them to be vocal and insulates them from criticism. That's what this woman is trying to do, right?
Right.
She's not saying I support laws that would allow employees to have freedom of speech and put that limit on at-will employment. No, the right is never going to take that fucking position. Never.
Well, this is the thing is, if you looked at the history of this Substack and the last 10 posts were Barry Weiss talking about union organizers being fired and like teachers who wore Black Lives Matter pins on Zoom and got fired. And in there, she mentioned, hey, I'm also not wild about this case at Levi's.
Yeah.
If it's part of a tapestry, I feel like I would actually accept somebody being like, I'm not super comfortable with the way that this happened. Fine. But this clearly is not Barry Weiss's project, because overall, if you zoom out, it's only people suffering consequences for conservative speech.
Yes.
Years ago, I saw an interview with a CEO. He said, the first thing you lose when you gain power in a company is the ability to think out loud. If you are the CEO of a company and you're asked on a panel or something like, hey, should we move our operations to Cleveland? You're like, oh yeah, that could be interesting. Yeah, we should look into that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, people are going to upend their lives. Your stock is going to jump all over the place. People are going to think, oh my God, can my wife get a job if I have to move to Cleveland? So you have to be really careful when you speak if you are someone whose words affect other people.
Right.
And I feel like this whole cancel culture, like from the top down view that Barry Weiss takes, right, where she only is interested in like magazine editors and CEOs and people with all of this societally recognized power being canceled from below, right? Being canceled by people who they have power over is just this complete misunderstanding of how free speech and how power works in America.
They don't want to have to trade anything off for money and power.
Right. It's also so funny too, like for people like us to be like talking about these cases, because like we both have podcasts. There are certain things that I also cannot say publicly. This is part of being a public figure. I don't love it.
You're right.
I get just like, why do I have to deal with this? But also, I'm a person with a moderately successful podcast who gets to affect other people's opinions on things. And part of the responsibility of that is you can't just say fucking anything anymore.
Right. It's part of the deal, and it can be annoying, but everyone knows that that's part of the deal.
Right.
And the people who complain about it are the fucking worst.
The fucking worst.
I think it's...
I mean, these are great points from the left. The more power you have, the more visibility you have, the bigger the audience, the more influential your audience, the more prestigious, the higher the status, your position in life, the more vulnerable you are to cancellation. So a college professor is much more vulnerable than a plumber, right? A TV news anchor is much more vulnerable to cancellation than a gardener. So with great power, right, you have to be more and more careful about what you say and do. I just thought that was just excellent common sense there coming from the left. Couple of lefties on the If Books Could Kill podcast. And the host, all right, he got fired from a major law firm because on the side he was doing a podcast about the U.S. Supreme Court, and they called him in and they got rid of him. All right, I loved this little message about the pitfalls of the spiritual bypass. I was listening to this morning, prompting my live stream about 9 hours ago.
To a lot of these things, and we need to open ourselves up to learning. So let me talk a little bit about what's happened. Why didn't this become the spearhead of the next major development in the program? Well, I think...
So he's talking about a letter by Bill Wilson written in 1958 who says 12 Steps should move its next priority to emotional sobriety.
That there's a tendency in recovery for us to use spiritual bypassing to cope with our personal issues rather than walking through the hell gates of suffering. That's the word that didn't get on there, the hell gates of suffering. Well, what is spiritual bypassing? Well, it was really defined by this psychiatrist, John Wellwood, and this is how he described it. He says there is a tendency to use spiritual practice to try to rise above our emotional and personal issues. All those messy, unresolved matters that weigh us down. He says, I call this tendency to avoid or prematurely transcend basic human needs, feelings, and developmental tasks as spiritual bypassing. Now, where that's relevant today is I hope you guys listened to that set-aside prayer when we started. because this part of recovery is going to mean facing ourselves and getting real honest with ourselves. Now, there's good news. I think only the best in us can see the worst in us. And I'll say that again. I think only the best in us can see the worst in us. But we have to be willing to be uncomfortable if we're going to become more comfortable. We have to be willing to move into these areas where we're ignorant and to own our ignorance and face our ignorance if we're going to develop some new ideas, some new skills, if we're going to get some new knowledge. And so let's look at what the definition of humility is. And I think that this is important. This is from the American Psychological Association.
Okay, I just love that point about people seeking like a spiritual bypass or a religious bypass or whatever kick they're on, the HBD bypass or right-wing politics or left-wing politics bypass. The world is so confusing. There are just so many options and choices. It's bewildering and exhausting, and it's so tempting to think that we can just have this magic key, that we can just, bypass the hard work of internal rearrangement. We can just bypass that with cold water or, the Wim Hof method or, just a new 12-step program, right? Great doco here on the rise and fall of the Wim Hof
I was
empire.
practicing the Wim Hof method. Ended up having a hypoxic blackout underwater, no life support for 4 weeks.
When he did pass out under the water and no one noticed, about approximately 30 minutes later that he was found.
And he was in like a meditative position underwater, heart's beating, but there was just no brain activities. He was sure enough a goner.
Anybody taking Wim's work and going into a pool and hyperventilating, you're just playing roulette.
There is no amount of money that can truly compensate for the death of a child, but this is a $67 million case.
There's nobody in that organization currently that understands the physiology. I don't think they have a grasp on it.
Orders: do not talk to the press. People could have died.
People have died. I never wanted to tell this story about Wim Hof. Instead,
okay, so many different approaches, many different people are wonderful in a certain degree, right? In a certain context. But when they get too big for their britches, when they take on the role of the all-seeing, all-knowing guru, when they think that they are no longer accountable to the ordinary rules of life, they get themselves and other people into trouble.
For years, I've told you about how his breathwork and cold exposure techniques helped hundreds of thousands of people develop resilience and control their anxiety, depression, and autoimmune illnesses. This indomitable Iceman has amassed millions of devotees to his practices, myself included. In 2016, we climbed shirtless up Mount Kilimanjaro together while the temperature dipped to minus 30 degrees. I can honestly say that I love his method and think that Wim is one of the most inspiring people I've ever met. We've been good friends for a decade, primarily because he understood that I would always tell the truth no matter what. And that is why I feel so conflicted about what I'm about to tell you.
Right, he's talking about all the
what
dangers
you probably know
to the
about
Wim Hof method.
Is a comfortable myth. It is a story that recounts all of the most...
We love comfortable myths. That 12-step will solve our problems, religion will solve our problems, that Alexander technique will solve our problems, that politics will solve our problems, that psychotherapy will solve our problems. We all love to cling to, one particular story, one particular narrative, when the world is far too complex for any one narrative or any one method for making sense of the big buzzing confusion surrounding us.
Amazing things about the Iceman and his methods, at the same time that it masks underlying problems within his organization and Wim's own meteoric rise into the limelight. After 10 years practicing his method and writing numerous articles and books that contributed to that myth, I've come to the inescapable conclusion.
A lot of things are great in moderation. A lot of things are great in certain situations, but you can take them too far. Like water is great, but you can certainly drink too much water. Exercise is great, but you can exercise too much or too hard. And Wim Hof method, all right, many benefits to it, but it can also kill you.
That it's time for me to report the full truth about how neglectful and deceptive activities at Wim Hof's organization Inner Fire, as well as what I believe is Wim's own culpability, repeatedly teaching a dangerous breathwork technique that has now led to the suspected deaths of at least 12 people. This story is complicated, but the most important...
Okay, terrific little doco here, the rise and fall of the Wim Hof method, but I know you want to talk Talmud, so let's talk Talmud here. Professor of Modern Jewish Thought, Mark Shapiro, letters from the Rav, meaning Rav Joseph Ber Soloveitchik.
Obviously for women, I showed you the famous picture of him with Rabbi Saul Berman and Rabbi Willig. One of you wrote me that, and I had already seen this, that Rabbi Willig actually taught the first Talmud shiur for the women. I mean, he was the Rebbe. The Rav gave that famous introductory Talmud shiur. So let's see what the Rav's reply was. But before I get to that, I want to show you something. I picked this up at YU in April of this year. Headline of the commentator: 3 Talmud courses on Barron campus canceled for next year. And it begins, the Stern College for Women Jewish Studies Department will not be offering introductory intermediate Talmud next semester due to low enrollment. And basically, for all this stress on how it's so vital for women to have access to Talmud study, there doesn't seem to be much interest at Stern. The standard, it says here, is a minimum of 8 students for a course.
Right, so there's all this emphasis on Talmud study. Okay, but women don't actually want to engage in it.
And yet they couldn't get that. In fact, there was even much lower than that in some of them. I think one of them even had, it said...
So this guy here, he won't mute his mic, so it's wrecking the show for everyone else. Right, one person can just disrupt an entire synagogue, an entire live stream, an entire highway, all right, just through your own selfishness and carelessness, lack of consideration for other people. This guy who intermittently shows up here because his mic is unmuted, all right, he's just, wrecking the show for everyone else.
No one registered for it, if I recall. Yeah, it says that 0 applicants for the second Talmud track. That's for I think for GPATs, and so basically it shows that it's not of that great interest. So I don't know what you make of that, but something like YU, you'd think they would offer it anyway because it's part of the ethos of what Yeshiva University is, and there was a backlash.
Right, so Yeshiva University is a modern Orthodox synagogue, and so they have taken on many modern values such as egalitarianism. And they try to apply that everywhere they can within the strictures of Orthodox Judaism. And traditional Orthodox Judaism, makes pretty dramatic distinctions between men and women. So one of my most common critiques of modern Orthodox Judaism is that it's usually neither modern nor Orthodox. It's a mess.
And they retracted the statement that they were going to cancel these courses. I don't know how many students are in it, but they're at least what I read is that they're going ahead with that. So
they're going against nature, right? It is not the nature of 99.9% of Orthodox Jewish women to deeply immerse themselves in study of Talmud, but they have this ideological commitment that they're determined to push, even though reality rejects them. All right, a lot of good stuff here in this talk from Mark Shapiro. I think September 19th.
That in our new era, where it's not the Rambam's day, we're not dealing with a Taliban-like society. Obviously, Judaism is not a...
Okay, so the Rambam refers to Maimonides, who died around year 1204 of the Common Era.
Absorbed just by mother's milk or anything like that. So what are you supposed to do? So the Chavetz Chaim already dealt with this when he said that in our era we need to teach Torah, and the Rav felt,
meaning teach Torah to women.
That isn't just teaching Torah. The Rav felt that you have to go further, and the Rav felt that you have to teach Talmud as well. So what does the answer say here? Beginning on page 81, and we went through the question last time. He has 2 letters. The first letter is he doesn't want to reply.
So these are Orthodox Jews who are taking on secular Goyish values and trying to combine the best of, secular Goyish life with the best of traditional Orthodox Judaism. And the result is a watered-down, compromised form of Judaism, and not many people get excited about a compromise, which is why you don't find that many passionate Orthodox Jews. Also, modern Orthodox Jews overwhelmingly go to a secular university. The more secular education people have, right, the less religious they become. Now, an elite can combine an elite secular education with a religious education and still lead a considerably educated life. But the more secular education you get and the more exposure you get to secular news media, the more you explain the world around you in secular terms. You explain problems between people in social and psychological terms. You explain natural phenomenon in biological and geological terms. You don't attribute things to God. And there's a saying in the Talmud, the best of doctors go to hell. Why? Because they believe it's their medicine that cures people and not God. So the more religious the person, the more godly the person, the more likely he is to attribute most of what goes on around him to God's will. The more you get secular explanations that are compelling, and more people, even Orthodox Jews, find secular explanations for what's going on in the world around them far more compelling than what the traditional, God-centered explanations do.
Why, unless they agree to accept what he says. He says he's worried that today we're in an era where there's so much partisanship. Some always want to liberalize the halacha, but others want to see the halacha fossilized. That's the word he used, and completely shut out of life. So the Rav is taking a middle of the road position against the liberals on the left and against the more traditionalists on the right, who fossilized the halacha. That just because the Rambam said this, then it wouldn't change the fact that reality has changed entirely today.
So let's say God delivered, every word of the Torah at Mount Sinai 3,200 years ago, approximately. That does not mean that every single commandment or principle that he articulated 3,200 years ago is necessarily still binding on us today, because situations change, right? When situations change, even if the ethic is eternal and immutable, the situation to which it must be applied has so sufficiently changed that an ethic from 3,200 years ago, even if it comes from God, not necessarily the godly thing to do right now.
We wouldn't make any changes. The Chavetz Chaim said it's harasha, it's Eis Hashem. You have to do it. It's an emergency time. So when Rabbi Rosenfeld said, we're going to listen to what you said, then the Rav replies, quote, today, not only is the teaching of Torah Shabbat Peh to girls permissible, but it's an absolute imperative. He says the policy of discrimination between the sexes as to subject matter and method of instruction that certain people advocate in our community has contributed to the deterioration and downfall of traditional Judaism. He says boys and girls alike need to be introduced to the inner halls, not just the surface level, inner halls of Torah Shabbat Peh. So you can't get any...
So Torah Shabbat Peh refers to the oral law, which is the repository, is the Talmud. So wonderful, beautiful sounding theories about how we need to teach women Talmud. But in reality, women just are not interested in studying Talmud. So all these men are theorizing how beautiful it would be to teach Talmud to women, but women, doggone it, just not that interested, just not that into Talmud study.
He says, I'm going to prepare a halachic brief about this, but he doesn't do this here. As far as I know, it never came about. So here we see the Rav, as strong as you can get, stating that today we need to, look, women are getting advanced educations at universities.
So there is an obligation in Judaism for the man to provide his woman with regular sex. There's not a similar obligation on the women to provide their man with regular sex. And so Reb Moshe Feinstein, probably the leading halachas, meaning decider of Orthodox Jewish law in America in the last half of the 20th century, he ruled that because we live in a much more sexualized society, that men were required to give their wives twice as